recognize those, Ms. Elwell?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
And what are these? Just specifically as a whole, what
Okay.
are these?
These states exhibit are all different photographs which I've taken as a course of my analysis from the evidence.
And do they fairly and accurately represent what you were doing and how you were documenting these things as they were being tested?
Yes, ma'am, they do.
And would they aid you in illustrating your testimony?
Yes, ma'am, they would.
Your Honor, the state would move to admit states 537 through 550 into evidence for illustrative purposes. Permission to publish these, Your Honor. Drawing your attention, Ms. Elwell, to states 537, and I will approach with what's already been admitted into evidence of states 271, and ask you to examine states 271. And did you analyze that states exhibit 271 in the lab?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
And what is it?
States Exhibit 271 is a sealed container which contained a carbine express arrow.
And did you perform any tests on this arrow?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
And what tests did you perform?
I examined this arrow for the presence of blood and did also examine it for the presence of human blood.
And when you say you examined it, what did you do to examine it?
I performed the Kastle-Meyer test. Well, first I visually examined the arrow, looking for any signs of reddish-brown substance. Again, all of you have probably at one point cut yourself and have bled on your clothing or bled on yourself, and you know what blood looks like. It's kind of a reddish-brown kind of color, especially when it dries. So I will look for those distinctive characteristics that would be reddish-brown in color, and anything that would give me an indication that I needed to test it further, I would follow it up with the Kastle-Meyer test, which I did in this case on the tip where the arrow is pointing. I did get a chemical indication for the presence of blood on the tip and followed it up with the confirmatory test and was able to confirm the presence of human blood on that tip area.
And
So I then swabbed that for DNA testing and gave it a sub-item 1-1.
may I approach?
Yes, ma'am.
Um, 271.
271.
Miss Elwell, I'm showing you what I've marked as states 551. Do you recognize that?
Yes, ma'am, I do. States Exhibit number 551 is actually a sealed manila envelope, and it does contain all of the samples that I had taken from various pieces of evidence in this case for DNA testing.
And it contained in that envelope, according to the markings outside, is States Exhibit lab number 11 in this particular.
Yes, ma'am, it is.
And I'm going to ask that you open that. Open States 551 out from the scissors.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Are there several samples, such as swabbings and cuttings, contained in this particular envelope?
Yes, ma'am, there are.
So, lab item 11, is that the swabbing that you made from this particular arrow?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Your Honor, the state, and is this in this envelope here that I will mark as State's Exhibit 551A?
Yes, ma'am, 551A does contain the swabbing sample that I had taken from the arrow.
And how do you know that?
It does contain my unique markings, which would be the laboratory case number, item number, as well as my initials and the date.
Your Honor, the state would move to admit into evidence states 551A.
Yeah, that's the photo or the swab? I'm sorry.
It's the swab.
Swab, no objection.
And Ms. Elwell, when you say swab, what does that look like? What is that? Is it like a Q-tip?
It's a long for lack of a better term, a long Q-tip swab. It's a piece of wooden stick usually, and it has a little cotton end of it. And so what we will do is we'll place some distilled water on that and then go and rub the stain so that we can transfer the stain onto that swab and be able to test it further.
And once you determined that this was blood and it was human blood, that's when you performed the swab? That's when you made the swab, is that correct?
Yes. Well, I first actually rubbed the sample, this blood stain first, and applied the chemicals for the Kastle-Meyer test. Once I was able to determine that I had a chemical indication for blood, then I took and swabbed it. Because I needed to have that swab form for both my human test as well as the DNA test.
And did you then perform the multi-step process for determining whose DNA it was?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
And did you come to a conclusion?
Yes, I did.
And what was the conclusion?
So a DNA profile was generated from swabbing from the arrow, and it matched the DNA profile obtained from Dora Faulkner. The DNA profiles obtained from Jerome Faulkner, Edward Campbell, and Eric Campbell were excluded from this profile. The probability of randomly selecting an unrelated individual in the population would be 1 in 21.4 thousand trillion times in the North Carolina Caucasian population, 1 in 7.93 million trillion times in the North Carolina black population, 1 in 143,000 trillion in the North Carolina Lumbee Indian population, and 1 in 138,000 trillion in the North Carolina Hispanic population.
And you said the other 3 standards were excluded, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am, they were.
And these standards, did they come by way of buccal swabs of Eric Campbell and Edward Campbell? Was that the standard that you used for their DNA?
I believe they were buccal. Let me see. Eric Campbell did supply a DNA cheek swab. And it appears that Edward did as well.
And the standards for Dora Faulkner and Jerome Faulkner, were they obtained through the blood card that is taken from the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner?
Yes, ma'am, they were.
Drawing your attention next to State's Exhibit 538. What is that?
538 is a green glove that I examined, again, in this case.
And what did you use the same test that you had used before to examine that?
Yes, ma'am, I performed the Kastle-Meyer test on that as well as the RSID blood test.
And what were the results of those tests?
There were 2 areas that were tested with the Kastle-Meyer test, and they gave chemical indication for the presence of blood. I did an RSID blood test after that, and it was also positive.
And after you did that, and you received the positive indications for blood, what did you do next?
So the area that gave me an indication for human blood, I was able to take a cutting from that for DNA testing, and that I labeled out as 18-2 on the picture. You can see that area and where it was, where the cutting was taken from. And because I had identified human blood on this glove, I went ahead and tried to determine if I could the wear of the glove. So I folded the inside of the cuff, which would be the inside of the glove area right in here. As you can see, the outside is pointed to, but it was actually in the inside there that was taken for DNA testing to try and determine who may have worn the gloves as 18-1.
May I approach?
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead. Maybe that's her what she said. Is it 18-2 or 18-1?
I'm sorry, for which one?
The blood's area.
It appears the area cut for DNA is 18-2, and then the swab for wearer was 18-1.
May I approach? I'm showing you State's Exhibit 515, and does that contain your markings?
Yes, ma'am. State's Exhibit number 515 is again a brown paper bag, which would have contained these gloves.
And drawing your attention back to the contents of State's 551, did you enter the cuttings?
Yes, they're sealed.
The state would mark these first, item 18-1 as 551B and 18-2 as 551C. And ask to move those into evidence, Your Honor.
Any objection? So 551B is 18-1, 551C is 18-2.
Yes, sir.
No objection.
And after you took that cutting and swabbing, did you test both for DNA?
Yes, I did.
And first, as to the cutting, which was made and is item 18-2, what was your result of that test?
So the cutting, which did in fact have the human blood on it, a DNA profile was obtained from the cutting from the glove that matches the DNA profile obtained from Jerome Faulkner. The DNA profile obtained from Dora Faulkner, Edward Campbell, and Eric Campbell are all excluded as contributors to this profile. The probability of randomly selecting an unrelated individual with the DNA profile that matches the DNA profile obtained from the cutting from the glove is 1 in 134,000 trillion in the North Carolina Caucasian population, 1 in 8.4 million trillion in the North Carolina Black population, 1 in 5.82 thousand trillion in the North Carolina Lumbee Indian population, and 1 in 225,000 trillion in the North Carolina Hispanic population. And I want to make sure I said it correctly. For the Caucasian population, it was 1 in 134,000 trillion.
So does that mean the likelihood of finding another DNA profile that matched that of Jerome Faulkner would be 1 in 1,000 trillion that you said? I know that that's not the right number, but the number that you said.
No, it's not. We're not looking at odds here. Basically, I would have to look at approximately 134,000 trillion individuals before I likely would see this DNA profile again. It's a difference. It's not necessarily odds. I'm actually looking at profile to profile.
And when you swabbed the inside of the cuff and you tested that for DNA, which is 18-1, what was the result of that test?
So the DNA profile that was obtained from the swabbing from the glove, that would be the 18-1. was, the DNA profile was inconclusive due to insufficient quality or quantity of recovered DNA.
So the sample was not enough, is that correct?
That would be correct.
I will draw your attention to State's Exhibit 539. Do you recognize that?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
And what is it?
State's Exhibit 539 is a picture which I took of some coveralls.
Are those the coveralls that you tested?
Yes, ma'am, they are.
I'm showing you what's been admitted into evidence as State's 512, if you will take a look at that.
Yes, ma'am.
And is that the green jumpsuit that you tested?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
And is that the green jumpsuit that's here in these pictures?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
And how do you know that?
Again, it does bear my marks. You'll notice that on our evidence, we have stickers, and those do bear a unique laboratory number that's given to every case, as well as a unique item number. When we receive the evidence, then we will place our initials and the date that we examine it, so that we can personally identify it.
And drawing your attention to the screen there, what areas, if any, did you, well, when you tested for blood, what were the results of that test?
There was a mix of results on this item for the presence of, or chemical indications of presence of blood. I tested a total of 11 areas. What is depicted there are, I believe, 6 of the 11 areas, which would be the front of the jumpsuit.
And then you tested, if I show you State's Exhibit 540, is that the back of or a different area on that same jumpsuit?
Yes, those were additional areas that I tested. Again, I tested 11 total areas.
So, and it looks like you made 3 different, 2 cuttings and then a swabbing, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. With regard to the 11 areas that I did test, 10 of those 11 areas gave me a chemical indication for the presence of blood, so I did further confirmatory tests on those areas.
And what were your results?
7 of those areas that I tested did reveal the presence of human blood, but there was additional areas that did not reveal the presence of human blood. I believe that was the 3 other areas. Yes, ma'am, 3 other areas.
And that could have been the presence of non-human blood,
Yes, that would be correct.
so animal blood.
Yes, ma'am.
And you took swabbings from 3 different areas, is that correct?
I swabbed the inside of the cuffs and the collar area, again, to try and determine if I could the wearer. That was not a chemical indication, that did not have a chemical indication of the presence of blood. That was, again, strictly for wear. There were 2 other areas that I did swab that had given me human blood results for DNA testing.
And what were those areas?
Area number 3, I don't know if it's how visible it is, but was up on there, was tested further. And
So if we zoom in here on the picture, Ms. Elwell, is that?
yes, that would be the area right there. Area number 3, as well as area number 11, was sent for testing, and that would be on the second slide. It's a kind of a muted stain, but you can see the discoloration in that area.
And so did you make cuttings of those particular areas?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
May I approach? And so would those, the swabbing be 19-1, lab number 19-1, the cutting from the front outside right pocket, would that be 19-2, and then the cutting from the back bottom leg be 19-3?
Yes, ma'am, it was.
And I would mark State's Exhibit 19-1 as 551D. Do you recognize that?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
And what is it?
551D is the swabs that I have labeled as epi swabs or skin cells. I'm looking specifically again for the wearer.
And are those your markings?
Yes, ma'am, they are.
And 19-2, I would label as 551E. Do
Yes.
you recognize that?
Yes, ma'am. 551E is, again, the swabbing I'd taken that had given me human blood from area number 3.
And 551F is 19-3.
Yes, ma'am. 551F, State's Exhibit 551F is, again, my Exhibit 19-3, which was taken from the knee area, which, again, did reveal the presence of human blood.
And so when you tested those areas first, 19-1, which I believe you said was the wearer test, what conclusion or result did you get?
Okay, with regards to the wearer, a partial DNA profile was generated from the sample. This partial DNA profile was consistent with having a mixture of 2 contributors. There was a predominant profile and a minor profile. The predominant profile is consistent with the DNA profile from Edward Campbell, and the DNA profiles from Jerome Faulkner, Dora Faulkner, and Eric Campbell were excluded from this predominant profile. And then there was also a minor component. The minor component of this mixture was inconclusive. I'm sorry, in this case, it was inconclusive due to insufficient quality or quantity.
And what do you mean by a mixture?
Okay. When I look at this DNA profile, it clearly shows me that there's 2 people that have contributed to this DNA profile. So there's a mixture of 2 individuals in here. There's a whole lot of one person's DNA and not very much of the other person's DNA. That's why I can say there's a predominant profile and a minor profile. I can liken it to a jar of marbles. If I'm looking at those marbles and I have, say, 8 red marbles and 2 white marbles, you could look in that jar and say, I have a mixture of 2 colors of marbles in this jar, red and white. And I clearly have a lot more red marbles than white marbles. And that's kind of what's going on here. I'm clearly able to distinguish that there are 2 distinct DNA profiles. One of them that I can be able to use for comparison purposes in this case, the other one I could not, due to insufficient quality and quantity.
And what statistical weight can you give to the match obtained in this partial mixture to the predominant profile that was obtained for Edward Campbell?
The probability of randomly selecting an unrelated individual with a DNA profile that is consistent with the predominant DNA profile from this swabbing is 1 in 188,000 for the North Carolina Caucasian population, 1 in 1.19 million for the North Carolina Black population, 1 in 99.2 thousand for the North Carolina Lumbee Indian population, and 1 in 189,000 for the North Carolina Hispanic population.
And drawing your attention to your item 19-2, which would be State's Exhibit 551E, the cutting from the front outside right pocket, which I believe on the picture here is number 3. Did you obtain a DNA profile from this cutting?
Yes, ma'am. Again, this is another DNA profile where I would appear to be 2 people in this mixture, a mixture of two contributors. And again, there was a predominant profile present. The predominant DNA profile is consistent with the DNA profile obtained from Dora Faulkner. The DNA profiles from Edward Campbell cannot be excluded as a contributor to this mixture. And the DNA profiles obtained from Jerome Faulkner and Eric Campbell were not, or they were excluded, they were not seen in this mixture.
So when you say can't be excluded, what does that mean?
When I looked at this mixture, everything that I saw was also seen in the DNA profile from Edward Campbell. So I couldn't exclude him as possibly donating sample to this mixture, but because it was not the predominant profile, it was the minor profile, I cannot be able to draw a definitive this is him or it matched him. I can just say he can't be excluded from this mixture. There was nothing that I could see that I could exclude him.
And I'm sorry, did you give the statistical weight to the match obtained for Dora Faulkner for the predominant part of this mixture?
No, I did not.
And what is that?
With regards to this, to the predominant profile, it's 1 in 110 trillion in the North Carolina Caucasian population, 1 in 19.0 thousand trillion in the North Carolina Black population, 1 in 649 trillion for the North Carolina Lumbee Indian population, and 1 in 338 trillion for the North Carolina Hispanic population.
I realize that you said that Edward Campbell was a minor. He cannot be excluded as the minor contributor to this mixture. But do you still, or does the lab still assign a statistical weight for Edward Campbell as not being excluded as part of this mixture?
Yes, because he is, because we're looking at his DNA profile and seeing whether or not it's present in the mixture. The statistics are slightly different. These statistics are basically talking about, again, how many other people could be in this mixture. With regards to the North Carolina, the chance of randomly selecting an unrelated individual that also might be seen in this or included in this DNA mixture. For the North Carolina Caucasian population, it'd be 1 in 1,400 individuals. For the North Carolina Black population, it'd be 1 in 6,970 individuals. For the North Carolina Lumbee Indian population, it'd be 1 in 33,470 individuals. And for the North Carolina Hispanic population, it'd be 1 in 1,540 individuals.
And drawing your attention, Ms. Elwell, to your cutting 19.3, which is states 551F, that I believe is shown on the screen there as the cutting that was taken from the back bottom leg of the green jumpsuit. It's on States Exhibit 540 there on the screen. Did you perform a DNA analysis on this cutting?
Yes, ma'am.
And were you able to obtain a DNA profile?
Yes, I was.
And who did that belong to?
The DNA profile that was obtained from this cutting matched the DNA profile obtained from Dora Faulkner.
And what statistical weight do you give to that match?
The statistics would be as follows: 1 in 21.4 thousand trillion in the North Carolina Caucasian population, 1 in 7.93 million trillion for the North Carolina Black population, 1 in 143,000 trillion for the North Carolina Lumbee Indian population, and 1 in 138,000 trillion for the North Carolina Hispanic populations.
When you opened this bag in the lab, before you began your testing and swabbing and cutting, did you notice anything, any odor or smell about this jumpsuit?
I did notice a kind of a chemical smell. Kind of a, again, I'm no I'm not a chemist. I wouldn't be able to identify it, but it just had a certain smell about it, yes.
Drawing your attention to State's Exhibit number 541, which will be on the screen there. Can you tell me what that is?
State 541? State's Exhibit 541 is a pair of blue jeans, which I examined in this case.
That's fine, Department. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our afternoon recess at this point. During our afternoon recess period, you do not talk among yourselves about this case. You do not talk to the parties, the witnesses, or the lawyers about anything at all. Further, you do not talk to anyone else, allow anyone else to talk with you to say anything in your presence about this case. If anyone communicates with you in any way, you let the sheriff know when you come in. Don't do any individual research or investigation on your own about any issue touching on this trial. Stay away from your smartphones. And do not form or express any opinion about this case during this time. Therefore, everyone else will remain seated. I'll excuse the 17 of you and ask you to return to some of the jury room at 4:15 this afternoon. Again, we go by that clock.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Elwell, I'm going to show you State's Exhibit 516, which has been admitted into evidence. And do you recognize State's Exhibit 516?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
And do you recognize your markings on it?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
And did you test this piece of evidence?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
And is it what is reflected here on the screen?
Yes, it is.
And how did you label this? Was that signature Levi jeans?
Oh, yes, ma'am, it was signature Levi jeans.
And did you perform the Castle-Myers test to areas on these jeans?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
Tell me what you did.
Okay, so if you'll notice on these jeans, I've got 3 areas marked, Area 1, Area 2, and Area 3. Area 1 did give me a chemical indication for the presence of blood. However, when I did further testing on that, I was not able to determine that there was human blood on it. I was not able to confirm that.
So I'm going to zoom in on Area 1. And you say that it revealed the presence of blood.
You'll see that little spot there. And it's actually, you'll see a blue area and then a black number 1. When we're actually doing our analysis, we'll write it with a pen, and then I'll come back afterwards in Photoshop and try to, in case you can't see the 1 real clear, I sometimes will Photoshop in the 1 to make it a little more clear. But the actual, if I could I get up? The actual area that I'm referring to is kind of more up in here.
And you said that the Castle-Myers test gave the chemical indication for blood.
Yes, ma'am, it did.
But the RSID test revealed...
Failed to reveal human blood.
So it could have been animal blood.
It could have been, yes. There were 2 other areas that I did test with the Castle-Myers test, areas 2 and 3. Those all gave a chemical indication for blood and confirmed the presence of human blood.
And so when you got the indication that it was human blood, what did you do next?
Those areas were cut for DNA testing, and then I also swabbed the waistband, as you can see up in the top picture. And again, I was looking for wear on the pants to try to determine if I could who wore those pants.
And did you mark the swabbing as 21-1? And then the 2 cuttings as 21-2 and 21-3.
Yes, ma'am, I did.
May I approach?
Yes.
So I'm showing you what I've marked as states 551G, 551H, and 551I. Do you recognize those?
Yes, ma'am, I do. They all do bear all my markings, 551G, 551H, and 551I.
And those are the cuttings and the swabbings that you made in this particular case on the signature Levi jeans?
Yes, ma'am, they are.
State will move to admitted evidence states 551G, H, and I.
I'm sorry, 551G is a swab, which swab?
It's 21-1.
Okay. And then 551H is 21-2?
Yes, sir. And then 551I is 21-3.
No objection, Mayor.
That's allowed.
So starting specifically with swabbing 21-1, you say that was the wearer swabbing that you did?
Yes, ma'am. The wearer swabber in this case, a DNA profile was attempted, but the profile that was generated was inconclusive due to the insufficient quality and quantity of recovered DNA.
So again, what was gained from the swab, it just was not enough. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am, that would be correct.
Could it be there was just not enough there?
Yes, ma'am, that would be possible.
And then drawing your attention to the front left leg cutting, which I believe is depicted here in this picture, and that would be item 21-2. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
And were you able to obtain a DNA profile from this sample or this cutting?
Yes, ma'am, I was able to obtain a DNA profile from both this cutting and the cutting 21-3, which was the exact same results, so I could read them together.
That's fine if we can just point out on this that states on the screen of where you made the other cutting, which was from the back left pocket.
Yes, that would be correct. You can sort of see, again, a little bit of that coloration right here. Right there, there's that kind of dark coloration there.
And would that be the same with what you have labeled as 21-2, which is the number 2 there?
Right, and that, right above my little blue tube is that discoloration. That's actually the sample.
And so what was the result of the DNA profile that you were able to obtain?
Okay, the DNA profile obtained from both of these cuttings in both cases were consistent with mixtures of two people. There was a predominant profile and a minor profile. The predominant profile matched the DNA profile from Dora Faulkner. And the DNA profiles from Jerome Faulkner, Edward Campbell, and Eric Campbell were all excluded as contributors to this predominant profile. There wasn't anything I could do with the minor profile due to the fact it, again, had insufficient quality and quantity of DNA.
So you were unable to say who was the other contributor to the mixture,
Yes, that would be correct.
but Dora Faulkner was the predominant result. Is that correct?
Yes, yes, ma'am. In both of these instances, she was.
And what was the statistical weight that you gave the match obtained for Dora?
21.4 thousand trillion in the Caucasian, North Carolina Caucasian population, 1 in 7.93 million trillion for the North Carolina Black population, 1 in 143,000 trillion for the North Carolina Lumbee Indian populations, and 1 in 138,000 trillion for the Hispanic population, North Carolina Hispanic population.
And drawing your attention to the next slide, and the next one. What is
State's Exhibit number 43 are pieces of what was identified as a crossbow frame.
and why do you say pieces?
It was actually in sections. There were multiple sections. It had appeared to have been broken. It was not all contained as one piece anymore.
And I'm sorry, let me draw your attention back to the Levi jeans that we just left. Did you notice any smell about those jeans when you opened those to test them?
I don't recall the smell as strong on this as the other. There
But
might
you
have been
do
a slight
recall the
recall.
smell.
I don't have it written, but I don't recall how strong it was.
I'm showing you States Exhibit 500, 500B, and I believe 500C. Do you recognize this item?
The initials appear to have been worn off, but I do.
And here's the outside of the box, if that helps you.
Yes, I do recognize it.
Are these your markings on the outside of the box?
Yes, my markings are right outside of the box.
And is this a picture of what you tested?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
And did you perform the Campbell test on this particular item?
I did.
And did it give the chemical indication for blood?
So, area number 1 is kind of the rail area of the crossbow. You can see up here, if you were looking down on it, you have the two pieces, and that was kind of a rail piece. The color area was tested with the Kastle-Meyer test. And I did get a positive indication for chemical indications for the presence of blood. However, the further testing failed to reveal presence of human blood, to confirm the presence of human blood. Moving on to my area number 2.
So let me just ask you quickly, that means it could have been non-human blood, such as animal blood.
Could have been, yes. Moving on to area number 2, I also got a chemical indication for the presence of blood, again, on the area that's, the stain is actually kind of off here to the side. If you can see the reddish stain a little bit over to the right of the red number 2. And that gave me a chemical indication for the presence of blood. However, further testing failed to reveal the presence of human blood on that item. My area number 3 gave me the presence of human blood. I was able to confirm the presence of human blood on this area. So a sample of that was swabbed for DNA testing. My area number 4 probably, there you go. Now this portion was kind of, if you were to picture a bow and arrow, it would kind of be the piece that would bend. You know, the string might come across the top and attach to the two ends, and it would pull back. So this would be the bow portion. Again, I'm not familiar with the exact lingo of a crossbow. I don't use those, but you can imagine it kind of being that little bendy part, and you would see that the string might have attached to the end right there to kind of orient you as to what's we got going on here. So my area number 4 did give me a chemical indication for the presence of blood again. However, wasn't able to confirm the presence of human blood on that spot. And finally, the handle area was tested as well. I was swabbing this area to see if I could try and determine who may have handled the crossbow. So a swabbing was taken from that, and I tested that swabbing to see whether or not I had picked up any chemical indications for blood on that swabbing. If I was testing it specifically for skin cells, I would not want to have it cross-contaminated with blood or chemical indications of blood. So I wanted to confirm that I was looking at something that would be strictly from skin cells and not possibly from a blood sample. So I did test area number 5, even though I didn't see any kind of staining on that specifically, because I wanted to make sure that the swab that I got off of that handle was going to be a swab that I could use to look for epithelial or possibly touch DNA. And that sample did, in fact, fail to reveal chemical indications for the presence of blood, so it was a sample that did not indicate to me that any blood was present on that swab.
And did you make any swabbings that you later tested for DNA from the crossbow?
Yes, so I tested the handle, and that was my item number 43-1. I tested the 2 areas that did confirm the presence of human blood, that being my area number 3, which again, as you can see on the top picture, and my, let's see. I believe that was all I had sent for DNA. Yes.
So just 43-1, which you obtained from the handle, and 43-2, which you obtained from what could be called the foothold.
Yes, ma'am. Those were the only 2 areas of, well, strike that. 43-2 was the only area that tested positive for human blood.
And the other you swabbed for what you refer to, I believe, as touch DNA?
Yes, ma'am.
So that would be to see if you could determine the holder of
Yes,
the
ma'am.
weapon. May I approach?
Yes, ma'am.
I think that was those 2.
Yes, I'm marking, is that what you have labeled 43-1?
Yes, ma'am. That would be the swabbing from the handle of what was left of the crossbow.
And so I will mark that as State's Exhibit 551J. And are those your markings there?
Yes, ma'am, they are.
And I would mark what you have labeled 43-2 as 551K
Yes, ma'am.
and move to admit those into evidence.
Any objection? Much obliged.
And so your State's Exhibit 43-1, which was the handle, were you able to obtain a DNA profile from that swabbing?
No, ma'am, I was not able to generate any DNA from this sample.
So it wasn't as if there was a profile and it was inconclusive. You just were unable to generate a profile altogether.
Yes, ma'am, that would be correct.
And the swabbing from the foothold, so your 43-2, were you able to obtain a DNA profile?
Yes, ma'am, I was. The DNA profile that was obtained from the swabbing from the crossbow matched the DNA profile obtained from Jerome Faulkner and did not match Dora Faulkner, Edward Campbell, or Eric Campbell's DNA. The probability of randomly selecting an unrelated individual with a DNA profile that matches the DNA profile obtained from that swabbing from the crossbow is 1 in 134,000 trillion for the North Carolina Caucasian population, 1 in 8.40 million trillion for the North Carolina black population, 1 in 5.82 thousand trillion for the North Carolina Lumbee Indian population, and 1 in 225,000 trillion for the North Carolina Hispanic populations.
And showing you next, State's Exhibit 544 on the screen. And State's Exhibit 196, if I may approach. State's 196 has already been introduced into evidence. Do you recognize State's Exhibit 196? And do you recognize the picture there?
Yes, ma'am, I do. State's Exhibit 196 is a brown paper bag which contained that glove which is depicted above in that picture.
And did you perform the Castle-Myers test to see if there was any indication of blood on this glove?
Yes, ma'am, I did. It failed to reveal any chemical indications for presence of blood.
And after you did that, did you make a swabbing from this glove?
Yes, ma'am, a swabbing was taken from the inside of the glove cuff area.
And would that again be for the wearer, as you had said before? You have said before in your testimony.
Yes, ma'am.
And what did you label the swabbing that you took from this left-hand winter glove?
It was labeled as item number 2-1.
May I approach?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm showing you what I've marked as State's Exhibit 551L. Do you recognize that?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
And what is it?
551L is, again, the envelope which contains the swabbing I made of the inside of the cuff of the gloves.
So that's your item number 2-1?
Yes, ma'am.
2-1?
It is.
Your Honor, the state would move to admit 551L into evidence.
You get it?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Lamb.
And so when you tested that swabbing for DNA, what was your result?
(2-1), my item number 2-1, which was the swabbing from the inside of the glove. A DNA profile was generated, but it was inconclusive due to insufficient quality and quantity.
So again, an insufficient sample. There may have not been enough DNA in the glove.
That's correct.
Did you perform any other tests?
On the glove, no, ma'am.
Yes. So I would draw your attention next to State's Exhibit 545
Okay.
and State's Exhibit, which has already been marked and introduced as State's 195. I'll show you State's 195 and ask if you recognize that.
Yes, ma'am, I do. State's Exhibit number 195 is a brown paper bag, which did contain this jacket coat, camouflage coat, whatever.
And did you perform any tests to reveal the presence of blood on this camouflage coat?
Yes, I did try an attempt to Kastle-Meyer test on this, but it failed to reveal chemical indication for the presence of blood.
And after you determined that there was no blood or that you couldn't find any chemical indications of blood, did you test it further?
Yes, I swabbed again the collar area, as you can see from where the arrows are pointing, as well as the inside of the cuff area to possibly determine where on this sample.
And did you make and label that, that swabbing?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
And what number did you give it?
It was my item 3-1.
And is it there in an envelope in front of you?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
May I approach?
Yes, ma'am.
I would mark that as 551M. And are those your markings there?
Yes, ma'am, they are.
Your Honor, the state would move to introduce State's 551M into evidence.
You get it? Mr. Lamb.
And Ms. Elwell, were you able to obtain a DNA profile from those wearer swabbings?
Yes, a DNA profile was obtained from this, but again, it was inconclusive due to insufficient quality and quantity.
And drawing your attention next to State's Exhibit 546. Do you recognize that?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
And did you test that item for the indication, chemical indication of blood?
Yes, ma'am, I did. The examination of this glove using a Kastle-Meyer test also failed to indicate any presence of blood.
It failed to give the indication?
Yes, ma'am, it did.
And after you determined that this was not blood, did you test it further?
No, ma'am, I did not.
And why not?
It was indicated to me that this sample had come from the vehicle, and the vehicle had been tied to the suspects in this case, as opposed to being at the crime scene. I had not found a blood stain on this, so I had no way to be able to tie this glove back to the scene. I could only tie it to them.
And so you, just knowing that it was in the suspect vehicle, did not test to see who could be wearing it because you made the assumption that it would or should have been one of the suspects. Is that accurate?
It's not unreasonable to have your own work gloves in your vehicle.
And so is that a practice that the lab, the crime lab, has, that it determines once things have been turned in to the lab what it tests and how it tests?
Yes, ma'am, it would be. Part of the job as a body fluid identification analyst or serologist is to be able to determine what samples would go for further testing to show a transfer of evidence.
And in this case, you made the decision not to do any further testing. Is that a fair statement?
That would be fair, yes.
I will show you next State's Exhibit 547. And do you recognize that?
Yes, ma'am. State's Exhibit number 547 was a shoe that I did analyze in this case.
And I'm approaching what's been marked and admitted into evidence as State's Exhibit 513. And do you recognize this as being the same pair of shoes that you tested?
Yes, ma'am.
And that's those New Balance shoes, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am, they are.
And did you test these shoes for the chemical indication of blood?
Yes, ma'am. I had 4 areas that are marked on there. Areas 1 through 4. And as you can see, there is some staining in these areas, especially over here, which number 4, you can show me area 4. Some nice staining in that area. Those areas all gave a chemical indication for the presence of blood. However, I was not able to confirm the presence of human blood on those shoes.
So meaning they could be animal blood?
Yes, ma'am, they could be.
And after you determined that this was not blood, did you test any further?
No, ma'am. That would be the extent of the testing I did on the shoes.
So you didn't attempt to obtain a DNA profile from these shoes?
No, ma'am. No, ma'am, I did not.
And why is that?
Again, I was not able to find the presence of human blood on the shoes. That's what I specifically was looking for, and therefore I did not look for wear because the shoes had been told me that shoes had also been taken from the vehicle.
And State's Exhibit 548, do you recognize that?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
And what is it?
State's Exhibit 548, again, is a picture which depicts the boot that I examined in this case.
May I approach Your Honor?
Yes, ma'am.
Miss Elwell, I'm showing you marked and admitted as State's Exhibit 514, and do you recognize these?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
And are these the same boots that you tested and the same boots that are pictured here?
Yes, ma'am, they are.
And when you got these boots, did you test them for the chemical indication of blood?
Yes, ma'am. I had seen 4 areas that I felt had potential for something I needed to test further. However, when I tested those 4 areas further, I was not able to get any chemical indications for the presence of blood. So I then rubbed the entire shoes, both of the shoes, to see if there was potentially a stain on there that I had not been able to see. And I did not identify any chemical indications on either shoe.
And did you test this any further?
No, ma'am, I did not.
And why not?
Again, because they were shoes that were identified as coming from the vehicle, I was not able to identify any human blood, therefore I would not send them on.
State's Exhibit 549, do you recognize that?
Yes, ma'am. State's Exhibit number 549 is a shirt, again, that I had received that had been identified as coming out of the vehicle. I did test 2 areas on that shirt, but was unable to get any chemical indications for the presence of blood on the shirt.
Did you do any further testing?
No, ma'am, I did not.
And I would just show you states 523. Do you recognize your markings on this?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
And does this, with the markings and the contents, appear to be the same white shirt that you tested?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
I would draw your attention next to States Exhibit 550. Do you recognize that?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
And what is it?
State's Exhibit 550 is a blue shirt that I had examined in this case as well. There were 2 areas that were present, marked as areas 1 and 2. Both of those gave chemical indications for the presence of blood. But it appears that the stains were originating from the inside of the shirt as opposed to originating from the outside of the shirt, so they were not tested further.
And so there was no indication of blood, is that correct?
No, there was a chemical indication for the presence of blood on areas 1 and 2.
But they were not tested any further?
No, ma'am, they were not.
And why is that?
Again, the stains that I observed appeared to have been originating from the inside of the shirt, not from the outside of the shirt.
And what difference did that make to you?
That the person who was wearing the shirt most likely would have bled on his shirt.
And I'm showing you States 524. Are these your markings on them?
Yes, ma'am, they are.
And is this the contents, the blue shirt that you recognize there? Sorry,
It's okay.
look in there.
It is, I'm looking from the outside of the bag and I'm able to identify that that would be what the blue shirt would have been in.
Miss Elwell, when you were on scene there with the Suburban and you took, you said some samples of some things when you were on scene, did you see a sword?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
And did you test that sword for blood or the presence of blood?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
And were you able to get any, did you get a chemical indication of blood from the sword?
Two areas of the sword were tested, however, I was not able to get a chemical indication on the sword for the presence of blood.
And I am approaching, may I approach, Your Honor?
Yes, ma'am.
With States 265 and its contents, which are 265A, B, and C, do you recognize these?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
And what are they?
States Exhibit 255 A, B, and C are swabbings that were sent for DNA testing.
And were they swabbings, as far as you know, from the back deck of 8067 Highway 96 North?
Yes, ma'am. These were samples coming from the third step of the deck, the back second step of the deck, and the back base of the step.
And did these, were these tested, first did you test them to see if there was an actual chemical indication for blood?
Yes, ma'am. All 3 of these areas were tested and did in fact confirm the presence of human blood on the swabs, and so DNA testing was done on these swabs.
And what was the result?
The results for all 3 of the swabs were the same. A DNA profile was obtained from all 3 of these samples, that being the rail above the third step, a sample taken from the back of the second step, and a sample taken from the base of step number 2. They were all consistent, the profiles generated were consistent with a mixture of 2 people, contributors. The major contributor was consistent with the DNA profile from Jerome Faulkner. The DNA profiles obtained from Dora Faulkner, Edward Campbell, and Eric Campbell were excluded from this predominant profile, and the minor profile obtained from all of these swabs was inconclusive due to insufficient quality and quantity.
So again, you could not determine who the minor contributor belonged to.
Yes, ma'am, that would be correct.
Drawing your attention back to, I'm sorry, where the processing of the Suburban. You indicated that you swabbed 2 areas from a tissue box in the console of the Suburban. Were you able to obtain, what was the result of that swab?
Again, those were negative for chemical indications for presence of blood.
And there was a broken arrow, is what you say?
Yes, ma'am.
Was that also tested for the chemical indication of blood?
Yes, ma'am, and again, it was also negative.
And there are 2, what you indicate is 2 areas of a wet suit. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am, it was.
And did that give any blood indications of blood?
No, ma'am, there was no indication of blood on that.
Now, Ms. Elwell, there were several items of evidence that were submitted, when I say evidence, clothing, that was submitted with these other items that you have testified to that you tested. First, a gray high Sierra shirt, a redhead rust-colored pants, a soft-back rust-colored jacket, green hooded coat, another pair of blue jeans, some white socks, and some blue latex gloves.
Yes, ma'am.
Did you test or examine any of these items?
No, ma'am, I did not.
And why not?
On August 26th of 2015, I had a phone conversation with Detective McPhee, and at that time I asked him if everything in the truck needed to be, or everything that was received from the vehicle needed to be examined for DNA. I explained that the other items that weren't examined in this case could at another time be resubmitted if that was necessary. And he agreed that at this time we would not have to examine every piece of evidence in that vehicle that was obtained from the vehicle, and that if need be they would resubmit.
And so cases remain open for resubmission at any time, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And do you decide when you're testing items, or when you have a large number of items to test, which would perhaps be the most important and which wouldn't be, based on your caseload, based on how many other things there are that you have to test in the lab?
We'll evaluate the evidence. Again, we evaluate and triage the evidence that's submitted to us for DNA testing, especially in these large cases. And I always tell the officers, if we need to go back and test further, or you need something else resubmitted, we can do that. But we have a case acceptance policy for the purposes of trying to evaluate and triage evidence, because we do work cases in all the counties of North Carolina. We do need to be able to have the ability to triage, and otherwise we'd be completely inundated with evidence.
And so sometimes in different cases, when you have samples, and I'll just say blood samples, that are collected from a crime scene, is it the practice of the crime lab, or is it the can it be the choice of the evaluator as whether or not you would accept or evaluate blood samples from a crime scene?
Yes, we can sometimes evaluate blood samples taken directly from a crime scene based on whether a body's still present, based on whether there's more than one bleeder. There's a lot of things that can play into whether or not we'll examine evidence at the crime scene.
So when you say more than one bleeder, if you have information that there were only, that you know who the bleeders were, for lack of a better term, at a particular crime scene, would that be a reason why you or the person who is accepting evidence would say, we don't need this because it's samples taken from the actual crime scene?
Yes, ma'am, that could be a possible reason. Unless you had reason to believe the suspect was bleeding, we probably wouldn't look at samples necessarily from a scene.
Unless there was a specific request to do
Right,
that.
unless there was a reason.
Thank you. I don't have anything further.
You want to ask anything, maybe we wait a little more. It's not fair to put you on the clock.
It's going to be longer than 3 minutes. It's not going to be long, but it's going to be longer than 3 minutes, Your Honor. So
All right, Jim, we'll take our evening recess at this point. During this time, if you do not to talk among yourselves about this case, further do not talk to the parties, the witnesses, or the lawyers about anything at all. further duty not to talk to anyone else, allow anyone else to talk with you, to say anything in your presence about this case. If anyone communicates with you in any way, in any fashion, you need to let the sheriff know about it when you come in the morning. So do any individual research or investigation on your own about any issue touching on this trial. Specifically, stay away from computers in any form. Don't read any all books or periodicals, anything like that. And do not form or express any opinion about any issue in this trial during this time. Told you don't get tired of hearing me say that. Now, with that, ladies and gentlemen, whatever else score remains seated, I'll excuse the 17 of you and ask that you return and assemble in the jury room tomorrow morning at 9:30. That's your excuse.